I only went to the garage for an oil change. I didn't expect my best friend's sister, the woman who could rebuild an engine blindfolded, to quietly rebuild me too. I still remember the first time I stepped into her garage. The place smelled of motor oil and pine-scented air freshener, with a faint trace of fresh coffee drifting from somewhere near the back wall. The floor was clean but bore the grayish scars of years of tire marks. Tools hung in neat rows on a pegboard, their metallic edges catching the sunlight that pushed in through the high window. It didn't feel like the usual chaotic repair shop. It felt cared for, lived in. She was leaning over the hood of a silver sedan, her sleeves rolled up just past the elbows. A thin smudge of grease traced her wrist, and her hair was pulled back in a low knot that somehow looked more elegant than practical. Her posture was calm and precise, like she belonged to that space in a way I never could. When she noticed me at the door, she straightened, wiped her hands on a faded cloth, and walked over. Her steps were steady, unhurried, but there was something about the way she carried herself, a quiet assurance that made the noise of the street outside feel distant. "You must be here for the old Honda," she said, nodding toward my car parked outside. Her voice was smooth, low, almost melodic against the soft hum of the garage heater. I nodded, suddenly aware of the dust on my jacket. "Yeah, it's been stalling every time I slowed down. Thought I'd better bring it to someone who actually knows what they're doing." That was when her expression shifted. She gave me the smallest smile, the kind that barely touches the lips but warms the eyes first. It wasn't a mechanic smile meant to reassure a customer. It was something gentler, almost personal. "I'll take a look. Might be the throttle body or just the plugs," she said, glancing toward the car. "Why don't you pull it in? I'll run a full check on the engine." The words were simple enough, but the way she said full check made me feel, absurdly, like she could see more than just the machine. I drove the car inside, and as I stepped out, she was already lifting the hood, the light from the ceiling catching the slight curve of her cheekbone. I stood beside her, trying not to stare, but catching myself noticing the tiny silver chain at her neck, the quiet strength in her hands. While she tested the connections and listened to the idle of the engine, she asked about the car's history, how long I'd had it, whether I'd ever replaced the fuel pump. Her questions were practical, yet every now and then she glanced up, and I felt that look lingered just a fraction longer than it needed to. There was nothing overtly romantic in that moment, but the space between us carried a sort of hush, as if the sounds of the engine and the street outside had drawn back to let something else take their place. Before I left, she wiped her hands again and said, "Give me a day with it. I'll call you once I've gone through everything. Your car deserves a proper checkup." As I walked out, I realized my pulse was still running quicker than usual, not because of the car's troubles, but because of the unexpected warmth I'd felt in a place that smelled of grease and gasoline. The call came later than I expected. "Your car's ready for a test run," she said over the phone, her voice carrying that same steady calm I'd noticed the first day. "If you've got time tonight, swing by. The shop's quieter after hours." I didn't ask why she was still there so late. Somehow it felt like the most natural thing in the world that she'd still be at the garage, working long after everyone else had gone home. When I arrived, the street outside was damp from an earlier rain. Raindrops slid lazily down the metal siding of the garage, reflecting the pale glow of a single street lamp. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, casting the whole space in a soft, bluish-white glow. The smell of oil was still there, but now it was gentler, almost mingling with the crisp scent of wet asphalt carried in by the breeze whenever the side door opened. She was bent over my car's open hood, her face partially shadowed by the raised metal. A single loose strand of hair had slipped from her knot and brushed against her cheek. She didn't notice me at first, too focused on the rhythmic click of her wrench. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, taking in the quiet scene, the sound of rain ticking on the roof, the subtle warmth of the heater humming in the background, and her calm presence in the middle of it all. "Need me to hold anything?" I finally asked, trying to sound casual. She looked up, startled just slightly, then smiled. "Grab that flashlight. Aim it just where I'm pointing." "Yeah, right there." "Thanks." I stepped closer, holding the light steady as she worked. Our shoulders nearly brushed as we leaned toward the engine, the scent of faint citrus soap lingering on her skin despite the grease-stained coveralls. For a while, we didn't speak. The only sounds were the occasional clink of metal on metal and the soft patter of rain outside. But there was a different kind of conversation happening in that silence. The way she would glance toward me to make sure the light was steady, the way my fingers tightened around the flashlight every time her sleeve brushed against my arm. "Your car's in better shape than I thought," she finally said, her voice lower now, less professional and more personal. "You just drive it too hard." I laughed softly. Guilty. I'm used to squeezing every mile out of it. That earned me a sideways look from her, a mixture of amusement and something I couldn't quite name. She leaned in again, checking the belts, her face close enough that I caught the faintest whiff of the coffee she'd had earlier. For a fleeting second, her arm brushed mine, a light, almost accidental touch that sent an inexplicable ripple of awareness up my spine. The moment passed as quickly as it came. She straightened, wiped her hands on a cloth, and closed the hood with a firm click. "There," she said, stepping back with a satisfied nod. "You're good to go? Just, maybe don't push it so hard on the corners." Her tone was half teasing, half serious, and it made me smile despite myself. We walked toward the garage door together, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the otherwise empty shop. Just as I reached for the handle, she added quietly, almost as an afterthought, "Thanks for coming by tonight. It's nicer working when there's someone around to keep me company." I didn't say much in reply. I wasn't sure I trusted my voice to sound as casual as I wanted it to. But as I stepped out into the cool, damp air of the night, I realized the car wasn't the only thing running a little too fast. A few days later, I went back to the garage to settle the bill and ask about a slight rattle I'd started hearing when the car idled. The late afternoon light slanted in through the high windows, painting everything in a warm, dusty gold. I found her near the back wall, standing by an old, silver coffee machine that looked like it had survived more years than either of us. She glanced up when she heard my footsteps and gave me that small, understated smile I was starting to recognize as hers, the kind that came without effort, but never stayed long. "Coffee?" she asked, already reaching for a second cup. "Only if you're having one too," I replied. "Always," she said, pressing the button that made the machine shudder to life. The aroma of dark roast coffee quickly began to drift into the air, mingling with the familiar scent of warm asphalt, oil, and faint citrus cleaner. We sat at a little metal table in the corner, its surface cool against my palms. Outside, rain had just ended, leaving the air heavy and damp, and through the cracked window I could hear the soft dripping of water from the eaves. At first, our conversation stayed on safe ground. The car, the weather, a joke about the stubborn coffee machine that liked to hiss as if it were offended by being used. But then, in a pause between sips, her gaze shifted, not quite meeting mine. "My dad used to sit here," she said quietly, fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "He'd start his mornings with this same awful coffee, no matter how many times I told him it was ruining the machine. He built this place. Every shelf, every drawer. When he got sick, I promised I'd keep it going." The words came out soft, but they carried the weight of years, and for the first time, I saw a shadow of weariness settle behind her confident exterior. I didn't want to break the moment with the wrong words, so I just nodded and let her keep going. "He passed 3 years ago. I still catch myself expecting to see him coming through that door in the mornings. It's funny how some habits stick, even when the person's gone." She smiled faintly, but it was a smile that barely held. I set my cup down and leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the table. "Sounds like he'd be proud of what you've done here. It feels like a place built with care. You can tell." She looked up then, meeting my eyes for the first time since she'd started talking. There was gratitude there, quiet, unspoken, but clear enough to feel. For a moment, silence filled the space between us. The only sound was the soft drip of rainwater outside and the faint hum of the heater. My hand moved almost unconsciously, resting on the table, just an inch from hers. I didn't reach for her, not quite, but close enough that the distance felt deliberate. She noticed. I could tell by the way her breath shifted slightly, though her gaze stayed on the coffee. "Thanks," she said after a pause, "for listening. Not everyone's good at that." I smiled a little, keeping my voice low. "Not everyone gives me a reason to." Her eyes flickered back to mine, and for just a heartbeat, the guardedness I'd seen in her seemed to ease. That evening, as I left the garage, I realized I'd learned more about her in those few quiet minutes over bitter coffee than in all the hours we'd spent talking about the car. And for reasons I couldn't quite explain, it made me want to know even more. The car chose the worst possible time to quit on me. It was a late Saturday evening, the sky heavy with the purple gray of approaching dusk. I was driving along a two-lane road that cut through the outskirts of town, where tall grass swayed in the breeze, and the nearest streetlight was half a mile behind me. The dashboard lights flickered, the engine coughed, and then everything went silent except for the low whine of the wind through the cracked window. I coasted to the side of the road, heart sinking as I shifted into park and turned the key again. Nothing. For a moment, I just sat there listening to the rustle of grass against the car doors and the distant chirp of crickets. My first thought was to call roadside assistance, but my fingers hesitated over the phone. Instead, I scrolled to her name. She picked up on the second ring. "Hey," I said, trying not to sound as frustrated as I felt. "Looks like the Honda's finally staging a rebellion." There was a beat of silence. Then her voice came through, steady as always. "Where are you?" I gave her the name of the road and the nearest mile marker, half expecting her to tell me to wait for a tow truck. Instead, she said, "Stay put. I'll be there in 20. True to her word, headlights cut through the deepening mist 25 minutes later. Her truck rumbled to a stop behind my car, the bright beams lighting up the gravel shoulder. I felt a strange wave of relief wash over me when I saw her step down from the driver's seat, pulling her jacket a little tighter against the evening chill. "Pop the hood," she said with a small smile, as if this were the most ordinary Saturday night plan in the world. I held my phone's flashlight steady as she crouched beside the car, her hands moving with practiced ease even as the drizzle began to fall. The air smelled of wet earth and cold metal, and the damp breeze made the edges of her hair cling lightly to her cheek. Instinctively, I shrugged off my jacket and held it above her to shield her from the rain. She didn't comment on it, but when her shoulder brushed against my chest as she reached further under the hood, there was a quiet jolt that neither of us acknowledged. At one point, a passing car sent a spray of muddy water across my jeans. She laughed, a soft, unguarded laugh that I hadn't heard from her before. "Guess the car's not the only one getting dirty tonight," she teased, her eyes glinting in the reflection of my flashlight. Her laughter lingered even after she stood and wiped her hands on a rag. "Fuel line's acting up," she said. "You can drive it, but let's take it slow. I'll follow you back." The drive back into town was almost silent, except for the soft thrum of the heater in her truck and the rhythm of rain against the windshield. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, though. If anything, it felt steady, as though, in some unspoken way, I'd begun to trust her more than I realized. When we finally pulled into the garage, she hopped out first and gave the car a firm pat on the hood. "See? She's still got a few more miles in her. Just needs a little care." Something in her tone made me think she wasn't only talking about the car. I hadn't told her it was my birthday. Honestly, I hadn't told anyone except my best friend, who texted a quick, happy birthday that morning before rushing off for a weekend trip with his fiancée. Birthdays had never felt like much of an event for me. Usually just another day with maybe a slice of cake if I remembered to buy one. That evening, I swung by the garage because she'd called to say the parts for the Honda had arrived and that she'd be there late. The sun was setting low, throwing long stripes of amber light through the high windows. The smell of motor oil and warm rubber mingled with something sweeter I couldn't quite place. Later I realized it was the faint scent of vanilla from a candle she'd lit on the workbench. She looked up as I walked in, brushing a loose strand of hair back with the back of her wrist. There was a spark of something in her expression, not surprise, not quite mischief, but something quietly pleased. "Perfect timing," she said, motioning toward the car parked neatly in the center of the shop. "I did a little extra for your Honda. Consider it a late tune-up." When I slid into the driver's seat to test it, I noticed the subtle difference immediately. The idle was smoother, the rattle I'd complained about days ago was gone. The dashboard gleamed like it had been polished, and even the floor mats were spotless. Then I saw it. A small folded note tucked under the windshield wiper. I unfolded it carefully. In her tidy handwriting, it read, "Figured you deserved a smoother ride. Happy birthday." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The note wasn't elaborate or poetic, but it hit with the quiet weight of someone noticing what you hadn't shared. When I stepped out of the car, she was leaning against the workbench, watching me with a subtle, knowing smile. You didn't think I wouldn't find out, did you? She asked. I laughed softly, shaking my head. I didn't think anyone would. She shrugged as if it were nothing, though the warmth in her eyes told another story. Couldn't let you drive around all year in a car that sounds like a tin can on your birthday. Besides, it's the little things that keep these old cars running. We ended up sitting on the shop's front steps as the sky shifted from gold to indigo, the air carrying a soft scent of rain-soaked earth from the storm the night before. The street was quiet, save for the distant hum of passing traffic. I pulled the note from my pocket and folded it again, feeling the paper crinkle under my fingers. You didn't have to do all this, I said. Her shoulder brushed lightly against mine as she shifted to sit more comfortably. Didn't feel like I had to, she replied. Just wanted to. Neither of us spoke for a while after that. There was no need. The warmth of her sleeve against my arm, the quiet between us, and the distant flicker of the street lamp were enough to fill the moment. It was then I realized that her gift wasn't just the tune-up or the clean interior. It was the way she'd paid attention to something I hadn't thought mattered. That kind of attention was rare, and it stayed with me long after I drove away that night. The storm rolled in just after sunset, sudden and heavy, the kind that makes the air feel charged before the rain even starts to fall. I'd gone back to the garage that night because she'd asked for help holding the light while she finished tightening the bolts on a stubborn exhaust clamp. When I stepped inside, the usual warmth of the garage had shifted. The air smelled of rain-soaked asphalt and cold metal, and the wind rattled the loose siding, making the fluorescent lights sway slightly. She was standing near the open bay door, arms crossed, watching the lightning flicker across the sky. Bad night for repairs, I said, shaking water from my jacket as I walked in. Her expression softened into a faint smile. Bad night for a lot of things, she murmured before turning back to the car. I joined her, holding the flashlight steady as she leaned under the hood. The storm's rhythm, the thud of rain on the roof, the distant roll of thunder, became the background to our quiet focus. I noticed how close we stood, our shoulders nearly brushing whenever I shifted to follow her movements with the light. After a while, she tightened the last bolt and straightened up, brushing her hands off on a rag. The tension in her face didn't fade with the task's completion. If anything, it seemed to deepen. She leaned against the workbench, arms folded again, eyes fixed on the floor as if choosing her words carefully. There's something I should probably say, she began, her voice lower than usual, almost swallowed by the storm outside. I set the flashlight down and waited. I've been trying to ignore this, whatever's happening between us, she said, still not looking at me. You're younger, and you're my brother's best friend. That's 2 reasons right there to keep my distance. I stayed quiet, letting her keep control of the moment. She gave a small, humorless laugh. But I'm not great at ignoring things. I keep thinking about how easy it is to talk to you, how you listen. It's been a long time since I've let anyone close enough to notice things like that. There was a vulnerability in her words that felt heavier than the storm outside. I stepped a little closer, careful not to crowd her. I felt it too, I admitted. From the first day I walked in here. I didn't know how to bring it up without ruining things. That made her glance up, her eyes catching the dim overhead light. For a moment, she looked younger than I'd ever seen her, less guarded, almost uncertain. The rain hammered harder against the bay door, and a low growl of thunder shook the walls. As if on instinct, a strand of damp hair slipped loose from her knot, falling across her face. I reached out without thinking, gently brushing it back behind her ear. Her breath caught, just enough for me to notice. My hand lingered for a fraction of a second before I let it fall. That's the other reason I hesitated, she said quietly, her voice steadier now but softer. I wasn't sure if it was real for you, or just something passing. It's real, I replied simply. That's why I've been holding back, too. I didn't want this to feel rushed or wrong. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The storm filled the silence, and the faint warmth of the shop's heater hummed beneath it all. Finally, she nodded, almost imperceptibly, as though she'd made peace with her own thoughts. Then let's take it slow, she said. A small, quiet smile tugged at the corner of her lips. The thunder rolled again, but it no longer felt as sharp. Something about the air between us had shifted, still fragile, but lighter, like the storm had carried some of the weight away. The storm that had raged through the night left the world rinsed clean by morning. When I pulled up to the garage just before sunrise, the sky was still a deep gray blue, but a thin ribbon of gold was already spreading along the horizon. The pavement in front of the shop shone slick and dark with leftover rainwater, reflecting the soft glow of the street lamps that hadn't yet turned off. She was already outside, standing by my car with her jacket zipped halfway and a steaming travel mug cupped in both hands. There was something quieter about her that morning. Not tired exactly, just calm in the way the air feels right before the first warmth of day breaks through. "Thought we'd give her a real test run," she said with a small nod toward the car. "See how she handles open road after all the work we've done." I smiled, catching the deliberate way she'd said we. We set off just as the first streak of sunlight touched the wet asphalt. The engine purred more smoothly than it had in years, and the soft hum of the tires against the road blended with the distant cries of early seabirds from somewhere beyond the dunes. The coastal highway was empty at that hour, flanked on one side by tall, swaying grasses still beaded with rain, and on the other by glimpses of a calm, slate-colored sea. The windows were cracked open just enough for the salt-tinged breeze to slip in, cool against my face. She reached forward to adjust the vents, her hand brushing lightly against mine on the gearshift, a fleeting touch that neither of us hurried to pull away from. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke, letting the road and the sunrise do the talking. When she finally did speak, her voice was soft enough that it almost got carried away by the wind. "Funny how a car can feel like a fresh start once you've fixed it up," she said. "Like you've earned another few thousand miles." I glanced at her, catching the faint smile tugging at her lips as the early light caught the curve of her cheek. "Guess that makes two of us," I replied. She turned to look at me, eyebrows raised in quiet curiosity. I just shrugged, smiling back, and returned my eyes to the road. We drove on until we reached a stretch of highway that opened wide to the water. The morning sun broke fully above the horizon then, spilling gold across the dashboard and making the sea glint like 1,000 tiny mirrors. She rested her elbow on the door and propped her chin on her hand, watching the ocean with an expression that was both peaceful and thoughtful. After a long moment, she shifted slightly closer, her fingers brushing mine on the gearshift again, this time lingering there as though to say that words weren't needed. For once, I didn't overthink it. I let my fingers stay where they were, the warmth of her touch grounding me as much as the road ahead. The rest of the drive passed in companionable silence, filled only by the steady rhythm of the engine we'd both worked to keep alive and the soft rush of wind against the open window. As the highway curved back toward town, I realized that something had settled between us. Not a declaration, not yet, but an understanding. Whatever lay ahead, neither of us had to face it alone. In the voiceover I'd later record for the story's end, I put it this way. Sometimes, the connections that change us don't begin with grand gestures or perfect timing. They start quietly, with a shared cup of bad coffee, a late-night roadside rescue, a drive at dawn. And if you're lucky, they remind you that even an old engine, or a guarded heart, can find a way to run smooth again when it's cared for the right way. We parked back at the garage as the sun climbed higher, casting light on the shop's worn brick walls and on us. Two people who had started out as near strangers bound by a car problem, now sitting in the quiet certainty of a road worth taking together.